Today, the epistle reading ends with a reference to this priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is a figure that is mentioned only very briefly in the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 14, we read about Abraham when he was still called Abram, and a band of kings come into his land, and they pillage his land, they steal his property, they kidnap his brother and take them away. And Abram then gathers together an army and goes out searching for these kings. He attacks them, he's victorious. He takes all the stuff that they stole from him, he rescues his brother and comes back to his own land. And after the battle, he's approached by Melchizedek. And so this is what we read about Melchizedek. This is Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 to 20. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe of all that he had taken back. And that really is just about everything we read about Melchizedek in the Old Testament. 3 verses in Genesis chapter 14. Now, although we don't hear a lot about Melchizedek in the Old Testament, he is still considered a very important figure, because in the book of Hebrews, which is what we read today, the epistle reading, 3 whole chapters are dedicated to talking about Melchizedek. And chapter 6 is the middle of that discussion. It's 5, 6, and 7. And the message in Hebrews is very simple. Melchizedek prefigures Christ. He is a type, a pointer to Christ. And so we have the fact that he brings out the bread and wine, which is very important, obviously, an allusion prophetically to the Eucharist. He is called the King of Peace, and he's called the King of Righteousness. So you see, this is a prefiguring of Christ himself. Now, there's only one other place where we hear about Melchizedek, and that's in a psalm. Psalm 110, or 109 in the Septuagint, verse 4, we read, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So what Hebrews is doing when it's mentioning this verse is it's quoting Psalm 110, verse 4. Now, Psalm 110 begins with another verse that's very important in the New Testament, in the Gospels. It's a verse that Jesus uses when he is confronted by the scribes and the Pharisees who are trying to convince the people that he is a false prophet. And we encounter this in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So this is what we read in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. When the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." And he said to them, "How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool'?" That's Psalm 110, verse 1. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone question him anymore. So, what we learn here in Psalm 110 is that David identifies the Messiah as Lord, and Abraham, through Melchizedek, offers the Messiah a tithe. That's important because it's telling us that the Messiah is greater than Abraham, to whom God promised that he would be the father of this great nation, and he was greater than David, who was the king and the greatest king of that great nation. And what we're seeing here is that the Bible is telling us that where God is going with the promise of a Savior takes us far beyond one nation in one part of the world at one specific point in history. That through David and Abraham, God will inaugurate a kingdom that will embrace all people in all parts of the world throughout all of time. But there's even something more here going on in Psalm 110 that we have to pay attention to. If we dig a little deeper, there's something very significant here. So, King David calls Messiah Lord. Now, there's only one who is higher than the king, and that's God. And Abraham, through Melchizedek, offers the Messiah a tithe. And tithing is an act of worship. And there's only one person that you worship, and that's God. So what we're hearing here in Psalm 110 is that the salvation of God is not just coming from God, but the salvation is God himself. Now, during all the Sundays of Great Lent, we hear readings, and the epistle readings are from the letter to the Hebrews. And one of the main ideas in the letter to the Hebrews is, people, what is going on here is greater than we think. That's kind of a general teaching. And so these epistles are used during Great Lent to remind us that what we are preparing ourselves for in this season, the celebration, the events of Holy Week, the celebration of Pascha, is something bigger than anyone had ever imagined, than anyone could have ever imagined. We are looking at God intervening in the world of human suffering through his own Son himself, the one that Abraham offered a tithe to by worship, and the one that David called Lord. That it was God himself who accepted death and descended into the realm of the dead with his life-giving presence to shatter the gates of Hades and to offer all people a way to be with him in life again. See, that's the hope that we have. That's what drives us as the church to pray and to preach and to love. And that's the foundation of the life of every Christian. Christianity is not simply a really wise philosophy about how to look at the world and how to treat people. That's there, but it's much more than that. We believe and we confess that God has acted in the world in a unique and profound way, and nothing will be the same again. We are participants in the great victory of Jesus Christ over sin and shame and death, and we become partakers in his glory. And that is certainly something worth celebrating at Pascha and every day of our lives. And it's also certainly something worth putting in the effort to prepare for during Great Lent and every day of our lives.